The garage was already loud before he arrived. Impact guns screaming, crew members running between tool carts, camera flashes bouncing off polished metal like lightning trapped indoors. But when Kyle Busch stepped into the tunnel, something changed. Not louder, quieter. Because NASCAR has always known exactly what to do with heroes. The sport understands clean-cut legends. It understands underdogs. It understands redemption stories wrapped in sponsor logos and victory lane smiles. But Kyle Busch was something more complicated. He won too much to be ignored, too emotional to be polished, too honest to be controlled, and somewhere along the way, the booze became part of the brand. The truth is, most people don't become villains overnight. They become villains slowly, one interview at a time, one rivalry at a time, one angry radio message at 190 miles per hour at a time. But that's what made Kyle Busch different. Because, while other drivers spent years trying to protect their image, Kyle almost seemed willing to let the public hate him if it meant staying real. And in modern sports, authenticity is dangerous, especially when it comes wrapped inside dominance. Because this wasn't just another driver. This was a man who built an entire career on proving people wrong faster than they could criticize him. And for a while, nobody could stop him. Not the fans, not the media, not the pressure, not even the sport itself. But behind every great competitor, there's always another story happening quietly in the background. A psychological one. The part cameras rarely catch. The exhaustion. The paranoia. The obsession with staying great after greatness already happened. Because eventually every champion runs into the same terrifying question, who are you when winning stops? And for Kyle Busch, that question followed him longer than most people realized. Long before the headlines changed. Long before the internet turned on him again. Long before the silence inside certain garages started feeling heavier than the noise outside them. Because the rise of Kyle Busch wasn't just the story of a driver, it was the story of a personality too intense to fit comfortably inside the image NASCAR wanted to sell. And that tension would define almost everything that came next. He was born in Las Vegas, which somehow feels almost too perfect in hindsight. A city built on risk, on adrenaline, on people gambling everything because they believe they can beat impossible odds. That environment shapes people, especially boys obsessed with speed before they're old enough to understand fear. His father worked on cars. His older brother, Kurt Busch, was already climbing through the racing world, and somewhere inside garages filled with engine smoke and late-night repairs, Kyle was watching, listening, learning, not just how to drive, how to compete. There's a difference. A lot of drivers are fast. Very few are psychologically overwhelming. Kyle learned early that talent alone doesn't intimidate people. Confidence does. Relentlessness does. The willingness to make every single race feel personal does. And even as a teenager, he already carried that energy. People noticed it immediately, not just because he was skilled, because he raced angry. Not uncontrolled anger, focused anger. The kind that comes from someone who constantly feels underestimated even while succeeding. That contradiction would follow him for the rest of his life. The faster he became, the more polarizing he became. And the strange thing about fame is that audiences love confidence right up until it becomes undeniable. Then confidence starts looking like arrogance, and arrogance is easier to hate, especially in America, especially in sports, especially when the same person keeps winning. By the time Kyle Busch reached NASCAR's top levels, he wasn't entering races anymore. He was entering emotional battlefields. Fans either loved him completely or couldn't stand him. There was almost no middle ground. That's rare. Most athletes live somewhere in the safe center of public opinion. Kyle lived at the extremes. And extremes create attention. Attention creates pressure. Pressure changes people. The victories came quickly. Then they came constantly. Truck Series, Xfinity Series, Cup Series. It almost stopped feeling normal. Not because winning itself was shocking. Because of the way he did it. Aggressively. Emotionally. Like every lap contained an argument nobody else could hear. Other drivers raced strategically. Kyle raced personally. And that intensity made him unforgettable. But it also made him exhausting. To competitors, to media, sometimes even to fans who supported him. Because highly competitive people rarely know how to turn themselves off. That mindset doesn't disappear after the checkered flag. It follows them home, into relationships, into interviews, engineers in training, or eat ITs, make smart choices balajoning. 7th eyes, ninth thing cost of elite performance. Nobody talks about enough. The audience sees trophies. They don't see emotional wear and tear accumulating quietly over decades, and Kyle Busch spent years carrying both. The wins made him legendary. The personality made him controversial. Together, they made him impossible to ignore. That's when the rowdy identity truly exploded. And psychologically, that nickname mattered more than people realize, because nicknames in sports become armor. They simplify complicated human beings into characters audiences can emotionally process. Rowdy, not Kyle the husband. Not Kyle the father, not Kyle the exhausted competitor, just Rowdy. The villain, the disruptor, the emotional loose cannon, and once audiences emotionally assign you a role, escaping it becomes almost impossible. So Kyle leaned into it, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because he genuinely couldn't help himself. Radio outbursts, public frustration, rivalries that felt deeply personal. The internet loved it, television loved it, NASCAR secretly loved it too, because every sport needs conflict. And Kyle Busch generated conflict naturally. Not manufactured drama, real emotional volatility. That authenticity kept audiences addicted, but authenticity comes with consequences, because eventually the character people cheer for becomes the prison they expect you to live inside forever. And as the years passed, something subtle started happening. The victories still came, but the emotional reactions around them changed. Early in his career, people watched Kyle Busch hoping to see what he would do. Later, some people watched hoping to see him fail. That shift changes athletes psychologically more than most admit publicly, because hate creates isolation, and isolation creates defensiveness, which creates even more conflict. It becomes a cycle, one that's incredibly difficult to escape while living under cameras every weekend. Then came marriage. And for a moment, the chaos softened. Not publicly at first, but emotionally, because Samantha didn't meet Kyle Busch as mythology. She met him as a human being. That matters, especially for people whose identities become consumed by performance. Together, they built something that looked stable from the outside: a family, a business life, children, a world beyond racing. And fatherhood changed him in ways many fans never fully noticed. Not softer competitively, more grounded emotionally. There's footage throughout later years where you can actually see it in his face. The intensity never disappeared, but exhaustion started appearing beside it, because aging in professional sports is psychologically brutal. Your body changes before your ambition does. Your reflexes become conversations instead of instincts. You start competing against younger versions of yourself while pretending publicly that nothing feels different. And Kyle Busch understood something terrifying that all great athletes eventually understand. Winning can become addictive. Not the trophies, the feeling, the validation, the control, the proof that you still matter. Once your identity becomes tied to victory, losing stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling personal. That's why decline hits certain athletes harder than others, not because they can't adapt, because they don't know who they are without dominance. And NASCAR was changing around him. Younger drivers arrived, new personalities emerged. The sport evolved culturally. Meanwhile, Kyle remained emotionally intense. In an era increasingly built around polished branding and media training, he belonged to a different generation psychologically, one that believed emotion was proof you cared, not a PR problem to manage. That difference made him feel increasingly isolated from parts of the modern sports world. But it also made longtime fans respect him even more. Because even critics admitted one thing: Kyle Busch was real. Painfully real sometimes. And authenticity ages strangely in celebrity culture. At first, audiences punish it. Later, they miss it, especially once the sport starts feeling overly manufactured. That's why his legacy became more complicated with time, not less, because eventually people stopped asking, "Why is Kyle Busch so emotional?" and started asking, "Do athletes like him even exist anymore?" That question changed everything. The later years of his career carried a different emotional tone. Not collapse, something sadder: awareness. The awareness of someone realizing the clock is getting louder. Every interview started carrying invisible weight behind it. Every season felt increasingly reflective. Every loss felt heavier, not because he suddenly became untalented, because mortality enters athletics long before retirement does. And deep down, competitors know it. The public sees statistics. Athletes feel time. That's why some of Kyle's most emotional moments had nothing to do with winning championships. They came during frustration. Near misses, mechanical failures, public criticism, moments where the sport seemed to be slowly moving forward without him. Because what terrifies elite competitors isn't failure, it's irrelevance. The idea that eventually the garage keeps moving after you're gone. New stars, new headlines, new favorites, and somewhere your name slowly becomes history instead of presence. That fear drives people harder than audiences understand, sometimes harder than love itself. But here's the strange part about Kyle Busch. Even people who disliked him watched him obsessively, because unpredictability creates emotional gravity. You never knew what version would appear: the smiling veteran, the furious perfectionist, the brutally honest critic, the exhausted father trying to hold together pressure most people would mentally collapse under. That unpredictability kept him fascinating, and fascination is more powerful than likability online. Always. The internet says it wants perfect celebrities. It doesn't. It wants emotionally complicated people it can project feelings onto. Kyle Busch became one of those figures, a man audiences argued about constantly because he triggered emotional reactions constantly. And maybe that was always the point, not intentionally, but inevitably. Because sports are never just sports, they become mirrors for ego, for masculinity, for ambition, for insecurity, for emotional control, for identity itself. And Kyle Busch reflected all of it back at people in an unusually honest way. That honesty made him controversial. It also made him unforgettable. Years from now, people will still debate him. Not just the wins, the personality, the energy, the pressure, the emotional volatility, because statistics alone don't create legacy. Emotion does. And Kyle Busch made people feel something every single time he stepped onto a track. Love, hate, respect, frustration, admiration, anything except indifference. And in entertainment, indifference is the only real death. That's the strange tragedy of fame. The public thinks legacy belongs to trophies, but legacy usually belongs to emotional memory, how someone made people feel. And Kyle Busch made NASCAR feel louder, more tense, more emotional, more alive. Maybe that was his real impact all along. Not just winning races, changing the emotional temperature of the sport itself. Because before drivers like Kyle Busch, many athletes still tried to appear untouchable, perfect, controlled. Kyle showed audiences the anger too, the ego too, the frustration too. And ironically, that vulnerability hidden inside aggression made him more human than many cleaner public figures ever became. Even now, there's something strangely haunting about watching old footage of him. The younger version looks invincible. The older version looks aware. Aware of time, aware of pressure, aware of legacy, aware that eventually every competitor reaches a point where the race stops being against other people and becomes against disappearance itself. That's the part audiences rarely understand until athletes begin fading from dominance. Because greatness isn't just physically exhausting, it's emotionally expensive. And some people spend their entire lives paying for it long after the cheering fades. Kyle Busch understood that better than most. Maybe because he lived it publicly. Maybe because he never learned how to hide it properly. Or maybe because deep down, he knew something the audience eventually realized too. The reason people could never stop watching Kyle Busch wasn't because he was perfect. It was because he wasn't. He was emotional, difficult, brilliant, impulsive, driven, complicated, human, and in a world full of carefully manufactured sports personalities. That became his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. Because the truth about legends is uncomfortable. The public celebrates the trophies, but the person carrying them usually sacrifices far more than anyone sees. And sometimes, by the time audiences finally understand the human being behind the image, the damage has already been done.